Hey, now my listeners, I want to talk about some recent polling from Gallup, which shows that a large portion of Gen Z does not feel like their life has any meaning or purpose. Now, a lot of their feelings about meaning and purpose are related to their feelings about work. And so I want to draw on some past episodes that we've done on the Know Why podcast to talk about how do we have meaning in work? Why is the way that we understand work's place in our life important? And again, what brings us happiness and fulfillment? We've talked about these on the Know Why podcast before, but always worth revisiting, especially at a time when so many young Americans are struggling to feel like their life has any sense of purpose or meaning. So first, let's look at what the polling actually shows. I'll link the report so you can read it for yourself, but overall, 45% of Gen Zers report lacking meaning, purpose, or both in their lives. Gen Z adults, I'm quoting from the report here, are nearly twice as likely as their peers who are still in middle or high school to indicate that their life lacks meaning, and are also more likely to say that they feel little to no sense of purpose in life. And one of the strongest predictors of whether or not Gen Z feels like they have a sense of meaning or purpose or not is whether they feel like they make a positive difference in the lives of others. So this is from the report. Roughly 8 in 10 Gen Zers, that's 79%, so you could basically say 80%, say they want a job that is mainly focused on helping others or making a positive difference in people's lives. However, only half or a little over half of adult Gen Zers who say they want that kind of job actually say that they work in one. So why are more Gen Zers not working in jobs that are focused on helping people? Because they see two main barriers. One is that those kinds of jobs where you're focused on helping other people or making a meaningful difference in another person's life, they don't pay well enough and they are emotionally draining. Those are the two main barriers that Gen Zers cite to being able to get that kind of job, even if they say they want that kind of job, because that is how they feel like they would have meaning and purpose in life. Okay. So we know that recently another survey found that Gen Z's number one cited definition of personal success was having a job or career that they enjoyed. So what we see here is this is all very job centric. Young adults are not feeling like they have meaning and purpose in life. They feel like if they had a job that was helping somebody or making a difference in the lives of others, then they would have meaning and purpose, but they don't necessarily. A lot of the people who want that kind of job don't have that kind of job, and the reason they don't is because they think that those kinds of jobs don't pay well enough, or they are too emotionally draining, like they're too hard. Okay, so this is kind of showing some, I think, lies that we have believed in our culture for a long time, and honestly that we've told young people for a long time. And so some false assumptions about what makes life and even a job meaningful. So here are the lies that I think we see coming through here. And I'm not blaming Gen Z. I'm saying this is how we've talked to young people for a long time, and it is wrong. So here are the lies that I think we see coming through here. One, that your meaning or purpose in life is exclusively or almost exclusively connected to your job. Like I think in our modern culture, we give way too much weight to our career or our job as a means of fulfillment or making a difference. I'm not saying that your work doesn't matter, but we place way too much importance on what we do for work, specifically what we do for money. And we put like almost all of our eggs in that basket in terms of personal fulfillment and our means of making a difference in somebody else's life. So that's the first big problem. The second big problem is that when you're talking about a job is only meaningful if you are doing something that is very explicitly serving others in terms of like working for a nonprofit where maybe you're not going to make very much money. So like, I'm working at the animal shelter, I'm working at the food bank, or I'm working for this nonprofit. And those are great. I've always worked for nonprofits, actually, but people, I think, kind of there's a stereotype that, oh, that is a kind of job that is very meaningful, but the reality is they don't always pay very much. Or you've got to be doing something extremely difficult, perhaps in like the medical field or emergency services or first responder, where like it is very emotionally draining and it is very difficult. And so people think, well, if I'm not cut out for that, then, or I'm not able to get that kind of job, then I can't have a meaningful job. Or if I can't afford to just work for like a nonprofit for a cause that I care about, then I can't have a meaningful job. So those are kind of the two big lies that I see coming through a lot of this data, I think, that shows some of the assumptions that people have. So that's why I want to look at two things. Again, I'm revisiting some things we've talked about in the past, but it's worth visiting again. So one of the first No I Podcast episodes I did several years ago was about what actually makes people feel fulfilled at work based on research. So here's a hint before we dive into all of that information. It has less to do with what you're doing and more to do with your internal attitude. But I also want to review what makes people feel most fulfilled and happy, so that maybe we can start to dismantle some of these lies that we have believed. And I'm not, again, saying that the job you have doesn't matter. The majority of this episode is actually going to focus on work, but we need to just fix our priorities in our mind and our understanding of what makes us fulfilled. So hopefully this is helpful to you in that regard. Let's jump in. Okay, what makes us happy at work? Well, to understand what we get wrong, we really do need to understand how intrinsic our work has become to our identity. So think about this. From the time you were a little kid, what's the number one question that people asked? What do you want to be when you grow up? Okay. And so from the time we're little, all of our extracurriculars that we participate in are focused on like finding your passion, and then how do we make money doing that? I mean, even today, I could go on a rant about this, and I won't, but even a lot of kids' sports from a young age are focused on, okay, making this a career. Like you even have high schools in states like Florida that are like trading their student athletes, trying to get ready for to go pro. Now, most people are not going to go pro. So if you have somebody who's extremely talented and they want to pursue that, then fine. But that's not only, I think, setting a lot of kids up for disappointment when they inevitably don't go pro, just because the majority of people don't, but it's also robbing them of their childhood, because instead of sports just being about like athleticism and character building and team building and things like that, even at that childhood level, it's all become monetized. So we are put so much pressure on kids at younger and younger ages to find the thing that they're going to do forever and pressure them to make money at it. And so that no wonder that our whole sense of identity for many young adults is tied to what we're doing to make money, what our job is going to be. But what if that's not the best way to think about work? And it's not, okay? So let's talk about something called workism. Now, this goes back to an article in The Atlantic by Derek Thompson in 2019, which is crazy to think about how long ago that is now, like 7 years ago. But he wrote a great article called The Religion of Workism. And here's what he shows. Rich men work the most these days. And in the old days, the richer you were, the less you worked. So why, he kind of dives into why this is. Here's a quote. Maybe the logic here isn't economic at all, it's emotional, even spiritual. The best educated and highest earning Americans who can have whatever they want have chosen the office for the same reason that devout Christians attend church on Sundays. It's where they feel the most themselves. So again, if you have been trained from the time you were a child to tie your entire identity up in what you do for work, then it makes sense that you're going to keep focusing on that. And it's not even about the economic success at that point. It's about your identity. It's who you are. It's how you understand yourself. And it's not just rich men anymore. Okay, so Thompson writes, Here's another quote. In a 2018 paper on elite universities, researchers found that for women, the most important benefit of attending a selective college isn't higher wages, but more hours at the office. And this is interesting because in that recent poll that I cited earlier, showing that Gen Z men and women, the number one thing that they said is their personal definition of success is a career that they enjoy. But men actually, like right under that, said that having children was also a means to personal fulfillment. And Gen Z women were focused more on career than even Gen Z men were. So I think this is not to bash women, but this has really been the emphasis for a long time, is that if you want to be personally fulfilled, it has to be focused on your career, your education, your advancement. That's really a message that they emphasized toward girls. I think to maybe correct for the fact that in previous generations, we didn't have as much freedom as women to get to choose what we wanted to do. But now there's such an overemphasis on that, that work has become even more intrinsic to women's identity than to men's. Okay, here's another quote from Thompson. In a recent Pew Research report on the epidemic of youth anxiety, 95% of teens said having a job or career they enjoy would be extremely or very important to them as an adult. This ranked higher than any other priority, including helping other people who are in need or getting married. Finding meaning at work beats family and kindness as the top ambition of today's young people. Well, it seems that things have not changed very much in the last decade, because those teenagers that were polled back then by Pew are saying the exact same thing today as we just said. So again, you can look at polling that shows that millennials and Gen Z want to make a difference through their work, and that's not a problem. But here's the problem, and this is one of my last quotes from Thompson's article on the religion of workism. The problem, he says, with this gospel, in quotes, your dream job is out there, so never stop hustling. It's a blueprint for spiritual and physical exhaustion. Long hours don't make anyone more productive or creative. They make people stressed, tired, and bitter. So he really identifies in that article this religion of workism, how we are placing our identity and our meaning and our value in what we do for work, and that even for this is especially true for the highest achieving people, which kind of makes sense because they're addicted to that work achievement. Not to say you shouldn't be high achieving or motivated at work, but it really helps you understand why some people seem so addicted to it, because that's their whole identity, and why you're seeing the majority of young adults say that's their main source of meaning. Okay, so if we want to really understand what makes us happy at work, we need to rethink our preconceived notions about our interests and our passions. So there's something called fixed theory, and that's the idea that our passions are ingrained in us from the beginning of our lives and that they can't be changed. So neuroscience shows that this is actually wrong, okay? So here is a Stanford professor, and he was interviewed by The Atlantic in 2018. He co-authored a study on interest and passions. He said, if passions are things found fully formed and your job is to look around the world for your passion, it's a crazy thought. It doesn't reflect the way I or my students experience school, where you go to a class and have a lecture or a conversation and you think, oh, that's interesting. It's through a process of investment and development that you develop an abiding passion in a field. So basically, this is the notion that your interests and passions can develop over time. You actually can discover new interests and new passions, and your brain science shows this. Now, I have cited Arthur Brooks multiple times on the Know Why podcast because his research on how the human brain works and where we find happiness and fulfillment is so important. He actually has a new book out called The Meaning of Your Life. I haven't read it yet. I've started it, and I do think that I'll probably end up talking about it at some point, but I don't really want to talk about it now since I haven't read the whole thing. But he has been writing about these things for a long time, so I think a lot of what is in the book is probably going to be kind of a culmination of several things that he's written over the years. So he actually had a series that maybe this is still ongoing, but it's been going for several years in The Atlantic, How to Build a Life. And so one thing that he's written about is what's the secret to happiness at work? Okay, so let me just quote from him. To be happy at work, you don't have to hold a fascinating job that represents the pinnacle of your educational achievement or the most prestigious use of your potential. And you don't have to make a lot of money. What matters so much is not the what of a job, but more the who and the why. Job satisfaction comes from people values and a sense of accomplishment. So this seems to be in line with what we were talking about a few minutes ago at the very beginning of this episode, with what Gallup found that Gen Z was saying, is that they wanted to have a sense of meaning and fulfillment through their work by feeling like their work was meaningful. So far, it seems like research is showing that, yeah, that's kind of what you need. But what about those barriers to being able to work a meaningful job? Are there only certain types of jobs that can fit the bill of actually being meaningful or making a difference? Well, let's continue to read what Arthur Brooks has said on this subject. He says, for real satisfaction, you should pursue intrinsic goals, two in particular. The first is earned success. Earned success instead gives you a sense of accomplishment, okay? So whenever you feel like you are actually earning success, you're accomplishing things, then that is an intrinsic goal you should pursue, and it gives you a sense of meaning. The second goal worth pursuing is service to others, specifically at work, the sense that your job is making the world a better place. But he says, this is really important, you can find service in almost any job. So I think the takeaway here is that you can frame anything you are doing in terms of how it is helping and serving others. You don't have to be on the front lines of a medical mission field in some faraway country in order to have a meaningful job. You don't have to be an EMT in the back of an ambulance, even though if you are, thank you for your service, in order to be making a difference in people's lives. Those are very clear ways to make a difference. But if you are thinking of anything that you're doing, frame it in terms of who are you helping? Whose life are you making better? Even your coworkers, because you're doing your job. What else around you is able to function better and more smoothly because you do your job well? Even outside of your work, like who are you providing for? How is your work related to your family? And even if you're not working for money, okay, you're still doing something important. There's such a problem in our culture with devaluing unpaid labor, which is really just like work that it takes for the human race to continue, whether that's caring for your children or caring for the elderly or caring for your household or paying bills and getting groceries and making sure that your family is functioning. All of those things are so important. And think about it. If you're not doing those things, what do? You pay somebody else to do them because it's a job. So just because you're doing that for your own family and maybe you're not making money doing that particular thing, it still doesn't mean that it's not work, and it doesn't mean that it's not valuable and that it's not helping somebody. So no matter what we're doing, I truly believe you can frame it in terms of service to somebody else, and you can see that it is meaningful. But even more important, you can frame it in terms of service to the Lord, because all of these fundamental truths about relationships and meaning in life, they can be found in Scripture as well. So for instance, the Bible talks about the most important commands not being changing the world, being successful, being perfect, making as much money as possible so that you can, give it away. But it's simple. Love God and love others. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, and love others as yourself. And the Bible also says that whatever you are doing, work is for the Lord and not for men. So if you are a Christian and you have this, then anything you do immediately has intrinsic value, regardless of what the actual task you are doing is. Because you can do anything and frame anything. And it's not just a framing, it's reality. It's what you're called to do in service to the Lord. And then there are so many ways that just living life in that attitude naturally blesses other people and makes the world a better place, no matter what you happen to be doing. Also, that's something that then can be carried throughout your whole life, whether you're a kid studying for a test or playing a sport or you're in college, or you're working your career, or you're retired, or you're taking time off to have kids and you're a homemaker at that time, those intrinsic goals that Arthur Brooks talks about and that the Bible talked about way before Arthur Brooks or anybody else ever did, those can be carried through no matter what you're doing. So I think, again, like if you think about what you do for paid work, in the grand scheme of things, you're not going to do that your entire life. Most people aren't. That's going to be a portion of your life. And most people today don't even work the same job for their whole career anyways. So it doesn't really make sense that our identity and sense of meaning is tied up in what we are doing externally, but we can have those intrinsic goals that can be applied to anything that we're doing. So to kind of wrap up the portion on work, we can still pursue dream jobs, we can still pursue things that we are interested and passionate in, but for a lot of people, it just doesn't work out that way. And we've talked about this on the Know Why podcast too, and I'll link some of those past episodes, but like it's kind of a myth that basically you should try to do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life, right? That's kind of a false expectation that I think prevents a lot of people from being able to be happy and satisfied when they have a job that maybe isn't their dream job, because again, they're buying into the lie that our whole sense of meaning and purpose should be tied to what we do for money. So what does actually make people happy? Well, let's go back to something I've talked about in the past, which is the Global Flourishing Study, which is super fascinating because it differs from the World Happiness Report in a few ways. Now, both of those reports I think are important, but they look at different things. They ask different questions. So the World Happiness Report asks these kinds of questions. And typically you see like Nordic nations scoring at the top of the list in terms of countries that are the happiest, okay? But in the Global Flourishing Report, Indonesia actually reported like the highest composite flourishing score. So if you're talking about Sweden versus Indonesia, like, okay, not hardly anything in common. So you have to look at what are the questions that they're asking. The World Happiness Report evaluates happiness in a really narrow way. What it does is it asks people a life evaluation. So they're asked questions that are kind of like on a 11-rung ladder. Okay, so they're asked to imagine, like, say here's a ladder, the very top rung represents the best life that you can imagine, and the bottom rung represents the lowest life. So somebody can look at their life objectively and say, well, I've got a house, I've got shelter, I've got food on my back, I can afford groceries, not food on my back, I've got clothes on my back, I've got food to eat, I can afford groceries, like materially I'm comfortable, and they can kind of objectively rate themselves as like, yeah, I would say in terms of kind of material potential and comfort, I'm at like the 10th or 11th rung, or like rung 8. In somebody who's in a very poor country that maybe they don't have as many material goods, maybe they would rank themselves on one of those bottom rungs. So that's kind of the way that it's defining happiness, which isn't unimportant. Like that's a valuable question to ask. But what the Global Flourishing Study does is it looks at a more comprehensive view, a more internal perspective of what actually makes human beings thrive. They're looking at things like relationships and that sense of meaning and purpose. So in the Global Flourishing Study, most of the countries that reported a high overall composite flourishing score, they were not necessarily rich in economic terms, but here's what they had. They were rich in friendships, in marriages, and community involvement, especially religious communities. So what do you see there? An emphasis on loving God and loving others, okay? Friendships, community involvement, marriages, religious community. All of those things inherently give life meaning and purpose. That is a theme that has gone through so many episodes, so many topics of discussion on the Know Why podcast about what actually makes people thrive. Not just how well am I doing materially, which is a question worth asking, but what is actually making people thrive. And we know that people are more fulfilled and have a better sense of meaning and purpose in life when they are connected to real embodied community and have real close relationships, not just like a shallow group, but like a network of people that they know, but meaningful relationships, involvement in their communities, and involvement in a religion, because you get that sense of higher purpose from that. So if we are looking at Gen Z and we are saying, okay, this is a problem. Nearly half of Gen Z feel like they don't have any or very much meaning or purpose in life. And then we look at what they're kind of tying that to and resting that on, which is having a very particular kind of job, which many feel like they cannot achieve. That's not good. So what we need to do is we need to look at what's actually making people thrive. And those are real relationships and belief in something bigger than yourself. And even when we're talking about work, because people need jobs, right? You can find meaning in your work, but it doesn't come necessarily from what you're doing externally. It comes most powerfully from within. And when it's coming from within, those intrinsic goals and that intrinsic understanding of the meaning and purpose of your life and having like an attitude of service that you apply to anything, then it doesn't matter as much what your outside job is. What matters is the internal attitude. So we need to be teaching these lessons to the next generation of people and help people who are young adults reframe the way they think so that, your happiness is not entirely dependent on your external circumstances. One thing that I loved, and I'll end with this, I've talked about former Senator Ben Sasse on this podcast before. He is struggling through terminal cancer, but he has been, writing a lot and doing podcast interviews and things like that in these months since he got that diagnosis. And his daughter wrote an article for the Free Press several months ago, and it was beautiful. And one of the main takeaways that really stuck out to me in that article is that she said every day her parents would ask her and her siblings the question, "Who did you serve today?" And that was so formative because no matter what they had gone through that day, it helped them understand that the world did not revolve around them and their immediate happiness, but it did frame their understanding of their purpose of life in terms of service to others, which, bingo, as we see from all this research, is what gives people meaning and purpose in life. So the way to set up your kid to be happy and fulfilled is to actually get them to focus on themselves less and focused on serving others more. So my husband and I decided to implement that question, to ask our kids, "Who did you serve today?" And it's been a really fun thing to do around the table in the evenings when we're eating our dinner. And it's really sweet to see our sons talk about, "Well, I helped my brother today," or I set the table, or I was kind whenever we were playing, or I was, I gave my friend a compliment, things like that. But it frames their thinking to really focus on how can they serve others no matter what they're doing. So I'll end it there. Check out all the links in the show notes if you want to read more about these reports or revisit some of the other episodes that I've referenced. But I'll see you next time on the Know Why podcast.